Good day to you, gentlemen. I don't know why my picture is right there in the middle of the slide, so we'll put me up here and leave me at that. Um, in any event, today is April the 2nd. We are working on chapter 15, and today we're going to talk about the second section of chapter 15, which is all about sex-linked genes. And so when we talk about sex-linked genes, we're not necessarily talking about ones that have anything to do with the determination of gender or sexuality or that sort of thing. We are simply talking about genes that are found on the X chromosome or possibly the Y chromosome, the two sex chromosomes, not one of the 22 pairs of somatic chromosomes. So let's talk about this a little bit. And let me move my ugly mug down here one more time. So concept 15.2 deals with these sex-linked genes. And they're interesting because they exhibit very unique patterns of inheritance. And it was Morgan, remember, in his work with the fruit flies, who determined that the white-eyed allele was actually being carried on this X chromosome in fruit flies, and therefore it was very rare to find a white-eyed female. It was usually the males who were white-eyed. Now, of course, gender is determined by your chromosomal allotment, all right? If you end up with two X chromosomes at the moment of fertilization, an X from mom's egg and an X from dad's sperm, you end up as a female. If you end up with a Y, you always end up with an X from mom's egg, but if you end up with a Y from dad's sperm, then you will be, genetically anyway, a male. Now, this is true for humans and other mammals, as well as other vertebrates. And typically, there are two kinds of chromosomes. The larger one we refer to as the X chromosome, and the smaller one we call the Y. And again, a person with two X chromosomes develops as a female, and a person with an X and a Y develops as a male. Now, this represents the human condition here. The male parent donates or has 44 chromosomes and the X and the Y for a grand total of 46. But only 23 of those chromosomes end up in either kind of sperm that he produces. The same thing is true, for the female, except that no matter what kind of zygote she produces, it will always get an X chromosome because X's are all that she can give. Now, birds, including chickens, have a very similar system, except that the homozygous organism ends up as the male, and the heterozygous organism ends up as the female. So the inheritance pattern is very similar, just kind of flipped, and we call it the WZ instead of the XY, just because we needed a different name for it. Some insects actually use what's called the XO system, where if you end up with two X chromosomes, you develop as a female, and if you have only one X, you develop as a male. And in other insects like bees and ants, for example, we have a haplodiploid system, whereas where a fertilized egg develops into a female, and an unfertilized egg that develops remains a male. So the diploid organisms are female, the haploid ones are male. So the reason that we call the X and the Y chromosomes a homologous pair is that there are genes on the Y chromosome that are analogous to the ones on the X chromosome. And so when meiosis occurs, before the organisms undergo that first meiotic division, the X and the Y will come together. And so the two chromosomes can behave like homologous chromosomes. But there is a gene on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene, the sex-determining region on the Y. That's a long name for that, but that's what it is. But that gene is responsible for the development of testes in an embryo. So if you have that gene, you develop as a male. If you don't have that gene, you develop as a female. So female gender is essentially the default. But if there is a Y chromosome present, you are going to develop as a male. Now, a gene, any gene that's located on a sex chromosome, whether it's an X or a Y, is a sex-linked gene. Genes that are found on the Y chromosome are Y-linked genes, but they are very rare. According to the little data point here, only about 78 genes have been identified on the human Y chromosome. More common, because of the much larger size, are genes found on the X chromosome, which are called X-linked genes. Now, how are X-linked genes inherited? Well, the X chromosomes contain a lot of different genes, and many of them have no relation to gender. They don't talk, they're no different for males than they are from females. But many of the Y-linked genes that we've identified are linked to sex determination, making you a male. So what that means is that X-linked genes have a very unique and special kind of pattern of inheritance. For example, if you have a recessive allele on an X chromosome, in order for that to be expressed in a female, the female would need to be homozygous recessive. She would need to carry 2 copies of that recessive allele, one on each of her X chromosomes. But in order for the male to carry that trait and to have that phenotype, he would only have to have 1 copy on his X chromosome, because his other chromosome is a Y, and it can't counteract that. There's no place for the dominant gene. And so therefore, what that means is that X-linked disorders are much more common in males than in females. So let's say that we have a homozygous female with the dominant allele, notice the big N here, and a what we call a hemizygous male. Hemizygous because it can't be homozygous or heterozygous because it doesn't have 2 copies of this chromosome. So, but it carries the recessive allele for this. So the sperm that can be produced by the male are shown here. The eggs produced by the female are shown here. And so what we end up with is all the daughters will be carriers of the recessive allele, and all of the sons will demonstrate the dominant trait. Now, if these offspring were to mate, then the carrier with the dominant male, you would end up producing these sperm and these eggs, which gives you all sorts of possible genotypes here. And so I've got a homozygous dominant, I've got a hemizygous dominant, I've got a heterozygous or carrier dominant female, these 2 are females, and then a recessive trait male. Now, what if I was to mate a carrier with a homozygous, or I'm sorry, with a recessive male, showing here? Well, in that case, here's the sperm, here's the eggs. The offspring produced here are, you've got 1 carrier female, 1 normal wild type male, 1 affected female, and 1 affected male. Now, examples of disorders that can be caused by this are color blindness is a very common one. This is an X-linked trait, and so therefore found mostly in males, where males can't see the colors usually it's either green or red. There are some severe cases where somebody can't see green or red. One of my college roommates actually was that way. And had real issues with stoplights, especially if they weren't hung in the traditional red on top, yellow, and then green. Because in some cities, they're side to side. Philadelphia is an example of that. And he had a real hard time driving in Philadelphia. Other examples include hemophilia and certain forms of muscular dystrophy. Now, there's also another interesting aspect uh, to the development of females. In mammalian females, typically, one of the two X chromosomes in each cell is randomly inactivated during development. And that inactive X chromosome develops into what we call a Barr body. Now, that's shown here. Here's the early embryo. And then in this case, we've got um, two different possibilities. The black furred allele is active, whereas the orange furred allele becomes inactive. On this side, just the opposite happens. And so therefore, depending upon after a couple of cell divisions during embryonic development, certain portions of the cat will have orange fur and other portions will have black fur. All right, we refer to these as calico cats. All right, so that brings us to the end of our discussion of section 15.2. Please have a look at your textbook. And tomorrow, on Friday, I'll ask you to look through AP review, the fourth review session, and I'll put that or post it on the portal. Thank you, gentlemen, and have a good night.